Greetings, everybody, to this week's Pluralia Dialogos, where I am very happy to be joined by Lawrence Freeman, a renowned Africa scholar, somebody who has been, you've done so much work in Africa over the course of 40 years, promoting economic development, physical economic understanding, and a liberation of all colonialized peoples from the shackles of the system of neocolonialism. So thank you very much for joining us, Larry. Dr. Uchenna Ekwo is also here with me, and Dr. Ekwo is the president and founder of the Center for Media and Peace Studies, Peace Initiatives. He is a Carnegie Africa Diaspora Scholar, a winner of the Ambassador of Peace Award by the Universal Peace Federation, and has taught at Rutgers University. Thank you so much for joining me, Professor.
Thank you very much.
Good to be with you, Matt and Uchenna.
We were just speaking a little bit prior to beginning this about the dangers of the potential revival of the Cold War doctrine of this Manichaean dualism that saw for many decades a lot of tragedy, a lot of injustice from both sides of the Iron Curtain that disrupted the dynamic. I think there was a certain dream at the founding days of the United Nations at the end of World War II that fascism was defeated, that a new world could emerge based upon the uplifting of everybody to a better standard of living. This is a dream of Franklin Roosevelt and many of his allies around the world. And that dream, which was again revived a little bit with John F. Kennedy and his allies in Africa and South America and beyond, de Gaulle, inspired many, but it was short-lived. And in the context of this cloud of the Cold War, of subterfuge and things, we saw instead asymmetrical wars, new forms of regime change, new forms of deceit, utilizing the cover of media and other things like that. We all know about the CIA's creation of Project Mockingbird and what have you. So a new era of lies just began to grow and become normalized. And right now we're under the danger, I believe, and I think we're all concerned of falling into a new trap of a new Cold War where these things could come to the surface again. At the same time, there's a lot of hope. There's a hope that we're seeing an alliance of nations that 60, 70 years ago were not so powerful. Today are much more economically strong, China being a big one, but many others that have formed sort of the bedrock of what some have called, or the growing BRICS alliance, the multipolar alliance in some cases, and a certain way of thinking which sees economic value and cooperation as not being based upon the might of the stronger to impose and to destroy the weaker, but rather in sharing the fruits of economic development. So there's a hope that this renewal of the healthiest spirit of Pan Africanism might be emerging right now and might break that entire continent free of colonialism in a serious way. Which is why I'm happy to have both of you here. Dr. Ekwo, who is a specialist in the question of democracy, media, truth for citizen participation. Lawrence Freeman, somebody who's very much an expert and proficient in the rules of breaking free of geopolitics and physical economy and development. So I think together you guys are going to make a fun team. And my first question is, do you think that we're on the verge? Actually, my first question is, many people say that Africa is simply getting sucked into a new colonialism with China, with Russia, with the UAE, and it's actually no better than what they've had over the last decades. Do you think that sentiment is true or false? Dr. Ekwo, I'll start with you.
Okay. Well, let me just go direct to the question. Thanks for having me. I think in 2014 at the first Africa-US Leaders Summit, I was there when Obama was in power, and I participated in a forum where there was a competition or a discussion about whether Africa should align with China or with the United States. And the discussion actually touched on some of the things you're talking about, because yes, China will give them what they want, especially the leadership there, the dictatorial tendencies, that some of them do have. They will have that freedom to operate, whereas United States will be, monitoring them to ensure that there is basic human rights, there is a rule of law and all that, while still supporting them. So, but unfortunately, most African leaders, some of them who do have those dictatorial tendencies, tend to gravitate to China, not necessarily because China is better, because sometimes China will, ignore all basic rules. They will ignore anything about due process and all that. All they care is just to suck their money. When I visited Sudan, I asked the Minister of Industries or something. Then, well, he gave a good explanation, because then the U.S. sanctions against the country was biting so terribly then. So they had no choice other than to go to China, because even the rule that says that the foreign companies should give employment to a certain number of citizens of that country, they ignored it. They'll bring even artisans from China to come over there to be doing everything. And the products they have are so inferior. If you go to their hotels, some government offices where they have contracts and all, they're not doing a good job, because the leaders will just ignore that, because China supports that. So to the question in terms of whether China or the United States should be better for Africa, so I am not even looking at it from that point of view. I'm looking at it from the point of view of Africa becoming self-reliant, irrespective, and deciding on what they really want, dictating the pace. Because for too long, they have allowed themselves to be directed by foreign powers. And for example, I don't want to go to history. In 1884, 85, during the partition and the struggle for Africa, Otto von Bismarck, who was the Chancellor of Germany then, called all these Western allies, and they stayed, and carved out territories in a map and assigned it to different European powers. No, Africa was there. Today, Africa, the situation has changed. Africa should be able to be on the decision desk to do a lot of things. So that tendency to always be relying on either China or that, and the so-called concept of China struggling for African resources, they should give them the terms to which they can struggle for these resources. And that will require some determination and positive leadership. We do not want to go through all the stories about the challenges about, sabotage, because there have been some African leaders that rose to the occasion and they were eliminated and all that. But the reality is that with what is happening with globalization and all that, and maybe we'll talk about that really, the harnessing the potentials of this multipolar world in which we live, the world is so long, it's no longer like in the 80s or even 70s where the US axis and China axis or Soviet axis dominated the political scene. Things have really changed. So I'm looking forward to a situation where there will be more renewed, pragmatic Africanism, that should have some kind of momentum, given even the potentials of technology, because it kind of cuts everything so easily. Unlike those days, you could stay in Nigeria and you don't even know what is happening in America. But today, instantly, you can monitor progress and replicate some good best practices in your own country.
Absolutely, yeah. Larry, on that note, do you think that this idea of asserting the sovereign right to self-determination is becoming more powerful in Africa right now amongst African leaders and African people in general?
There's clearly a movement for among African leaders for Africans to have more agency in deciding their future. I don't agree at all that China is the new colonialism. I see absolutely zero evidence of that. I think that, if you look at the entirety from, let's say, the end of World War I up until the present, most of what the West has done is just extracted resources. China has a different model where they allow countries to use their resources to make payments for actual infrastructure. And I've seen this in many parts of Africa. One of them that warmed my heart was taking the train from Abuja to Kaduna in 2022. Since I spent, I don't know, 15 times going to Africa and there was never a railroad. And the Chinese helped build a railroad and many more railroad projects in view. So we're seeing the potential now for Africa to play a more important role in its own self-determination. And I think this raises a larger question, which is that the dominance of the West, which goes currently by the name of the rules-based order, is collapsing. It no longer has the complete dominance that it has had since 1945. And China and the BRICS, which has 10 members, 3 of them in African countries, has 10 additional partners, 3 of which are African nations, a total now of South Africa, Egypt, Ethiopia, Nigeria, Uganda, and Algeria. And the global South is now moving in a different direction, a different paradigm, if you will. And if you go through the pain of reading the Council on Foreign Relations magazine and newsletter, Foreign Affairs and their newsletter, every week they're bemoaning the fact that the West has lost control of the world and we're moving towards a new multipolarity. And I think China, I think Africa can play a major role in that. Now, I don't know, honestly speaking, Uchenna may think differently. I don't know if Pan Africanism is going to be the vehicle for the change. We do know there's a African continental free trade area agreement, but for Africa to make more clearly its own determination in the future, it needs desperately infrastructure, and especially electricity and rail. Without that, they really can't determine their own future. They can't eliminate poverty. So there's a movement I see. I don't see it across the continent. I see it country by country. Individual leaders are putting forth policies for their own actual, what I call physical economic development. I think if you listen to the South African president, Cyril Ramaphosa at the UN, he actually talked about the need for a new financial architecture. Others have been less vocal. Many leaders have talked about the need for Africans to set up industry and manufacturing to add value or beneficiation to their resources. So these are all positive developments, which I think are part of a larger international Teutonic shakeup of the world. The West is no longer in charge, nor should it be, until it changes. And the global South is on the rise, although it still needs a lot of direction and support to develop 87% of the world's population. But that's the future that I see. And I think that's what we all have to be fighting for.
Let me just.
Oh, yes, sorry. Dr. Uchenna, yes, of course.
At the beginning, Lawrence said that, there was no real lines in Africa in the past. Now there is. But yeah, he's right and not right to an extent. The colonial government, specifically in Nigeria, they built rail lines not for human beings to move from point A to point B, but for goods to be shipped to the Atlantic Ocean and then brought to the West. So, but today, like what Lawrence experienced recently in Nigeria, we now have rail lines that were put together to move people from point A to point B, no longer just goods and services. And it's no longer terminating at the ports where the ships will just transport some cocoa and all these materials to the West. So I just wanted to point that out.
No, that's good. And that actually reminded me, in the Africa Union Agenda 2063 report, which has got some very beautiful ideas in it. It's been many years that it was released, and it's been updated. Ideas have been added to over time. But there's this glorious concept, which I'm just going to illustrate right here, featuring a map of rail lines, some high speed, that could be developed over the ensuing decades, that could unite in common gauge rail all of Africa. I think there's something like 9 or 10 rail lines, 3 north-south, and then 6 east-west, with what appears to me, I think the looking at some of the discussions, and I follow your website, Larry, quite a bit, that one of the most potent or strategic lines of all of them would be the one that would go from Addis Ababa or Djibouti all the way to the Atlantic. And I couldn't help, because this is very different from what you just mentioned, Dr. Ekwo, of the heritage of the Cecil Rhodes colonialism and the European powers that would always build rail lines, but they would never be a common gauge. So they were designed to not be able to ever meet, so that Africa would be more divided, more easily conquered, and only rail from the mines to the ports would be permitted, but not anything that would benefit the people or create a better world. And this is a very different idea.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, there's something that's been going on since 2020, especially this wave of, they call it the coup belt. The coup belt is the term that has been used. And I couldn't help but notice that a lot of those countries, Gabon and Mali, and maybe not Burkina Faso, but yeah, Burkina Faso, Chad, fall along this coup belt, where a rail line could easily be, that most strategic line in green could be built that connect all the way through Ethiopia, which is also going through some incredibly positive movements right now. Do you see anything? Do you see anything positive coming from the Alliance of Sahel states that have emerged out of these new governments that could move in that direction more efficiently, Dr. Ekwo, or do you see that as still something that is underdeveloped or not so positive?
Oh, my response to that would be, that the African leaders actually should anchor more on partnership. Because when you are engaged in a partnership with someone, you are relating on a different level than when you just depend on them to come and help you. So that's one strategic thing that ship there, I guess, should, like what Lawrence also experienced in Nigeria. If the authorities in Nigeria will deal with China on a partnership basis to come and help them, maybe because they have more technological endowment to, bring about an efficient railway system. Yeah, that's okay, all right? Because when you're in a partnership, all of you are contributing to make sure that this thing succeeds, as opposed to when you're just so dependent on them. And like what you also talked about the shift, the rail lines, like the one you talked about from the east to the west, to the Atlantic Ocean, that's also huge, because while this thing is moving, it's not just goods and services that are moving, individuals are also moving. I can tell you that there's so much experience some of us have had. I can't travel freely in Africa by air. One day I traveled from the United States to Nigeria, and I was supposed to go to Conakry in Guinea to deliver a paper. And I realized the cost of going there was even more than the cost of traveling from US to Nigeria. Think about that. So, but if there was that kind of railway system, for example, that problem will be solved. Because even the Yamoussoukro Convention that tried to, I'm happy you mentioned this agenda 2063, they talk about all those things, but they are mostly theoretical, right? The Yamoussoukro Convention that talked about liberalizing the air transportation, to date, it has not taken shape, okay? I understand when I discuss with some of the operators, yeah, it's a business philosophy, because we don't have enough people to be moving from this and that. But again, it makes life difficult. But this rail transportation should be able to take care of some of these ideas I'm talking about by networking people, networking cities, and all that. So and again, honestly, it's going to be a huge game changer. should it be implemented? Because as Lawrence can testify, maybe he can also tell the story about what he saw in Abuja. The fact that you can just stay in a train station and get from Kaduna to Abuja, something that never happened in the past, that's huge. And in a comfortable environment, you're not afraid of kidnappers or whatever, or motor accidents or so, because the road network is not as safe as perhaps you have this rail system if it works. Okay, so I really think that it's a big game changer if Africa should invest in that. Look, I'm able to travel from here in New York to Washington or different parts of the United States through railroad. So it didn't just happen by, it's not a happenstance. Someone planned that. So the investment of Lincoln and other past leaders in this country, somehow we should think about how to emulate some of these ideas in Africa, not just about, because that's how you can really improve the human condition.
Yeah.
And you leave a legacy, and you have economic development, because all these things will boost economic development. Let's face it, if someone is traveling from Ethiopia to Nigeria to sell his or her goods, he can stay in that road and make that happen. Or even if you don't want to go, this thing could be transported easily within a specific time. So it's going to really change the whole dynamic, quite frankly. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
We discussed this at this conference. I was at the Second International Rail Conference in Abuja on the 15th and 16th of September. So there was a great deal of discussion about expanding the railroad system in Nigeria, and they have to move away from the old British colonial narrow gauge to a more modern standard gauge. But they also brought up something which has not been concluded, but it's a proposal to build 4,000 kilometers of high-speed rail in Nigeria. Now, this is nothing short of revolutionary, because they're talking about the actual high speed, which is 345 kilometers per hour, 215 miles per hour, which only exists in China. And I've been able to take that railroad, and it was one of the great moments of my trip to China. But the fact of the matter is that the diagram that you showed, Matt, is what the Agenda 2063. But there's problems with that. First of all, that's 40 years from now. That's way too long to wait. Two, there was a presentation by a Nigerian who's an expert in rail management, Roland Ataguba, at the conference. And he showed that map. And then he showed another map, which shows all the small rail lines that are being built by each country, which are not anywhere close to being connected, not even close. So he's proposing a top-down reorganization of the railroad system in Africa to complete connectivity of the type that's in your map to be done in 13 years. Because right now it's each country on its own. Nigeria is doing a north-south loop. They have an east-west loop, in the south. They have a northwest loop already. There are others, but there's no organization to make this part.
Is he calling for the Africa Union to take on a more active role as a central agency, or how is he thinking about it?
He's actually presented a very detailed flowchart of setting up an organization to assist the African Union from the top down, region by region, country by country, to actually bring about this 2063 agenda item of rail in a much less time. So it would work with the African Union. I mean, the African Union is the only existing African association. Sometimes it's very weak, but it's still the only one we have that represents all of Africa. But this is the future, which my estimation is we need 100,000 additional kilometers of rail to carry out full connectivity between all the major capitals, all the major manufacturing centers, and all the major ports. This is essential. It's not optional. And that various countries are pursuing their own way. I mean, Tanzania is building a railroad across Tanzania. I think the hook up with Uganda. There are plans for Ethiopia railroad to go south. into Kenya and Tanzania. I mean, we have now the Libido Corridor, which is talking about a railroad across portions of East-West Africa. So there are various plans and various proposals which African governments are promoting with various support. The Libido Corridor is the first one that has any Western support in maybe 60 years. But we need a much greater emphasis. I've advocated a military style organization, top down, to bring about these two areas of infrastructure, energy and rail, have to be completed. But we're moving in a positive direction, but potential is much larger. I mean, my vision is an east-west railroad, which you showed from Djibouti to Dakar, which would be a high-speed railroad. And then along that would be a spine where you have manufacturing centers, you'd have agricultural centers, you have electricity running along there. And many of the plans in Nigeria are for electrified railroad, where they would use their huge supply of gas to run a railroad through cables connecting to the cars through electricity. Because the gas is there and it's not being used. And there's all kinds of potential. I mean, they're massive in Africa.
Well, that's what kills me the most, to look at this potential and to see that, like, you had cited not that long ago, a statistic that caught my eye, that Africa still imports 1/3 of its food to the continent, which, when you look at the potential of the breadbasket, the Sahel, the entire agricultural potential is outstanding. Africa should be overall exporting food and feeding all of its own people at the same time. The amount of poverty is unbearable when you look at the amount of wealth that is all, like, under the ground, under the soil. There's so much wealth, and then you've got the manufacturing potential. There's no reason to have as much poverty as you have in Nigeria, and I think it was something like 690 of the 692 million people who live in abject poverty, 464 million are in Africa, and it's so unnecessary. But then the question becomes, it's clear that what's lacking has been authentic, like, planning, like, as we've seen in the better examples of the US that was able to think of itself at different moments. I wouldn't say all the time, but at its better moments, it was able to think of itself as a big nation with many parts that have a common destiny, that could then plan, like Dr. Ekwo said, the transcontinental railway, different things that uplifted people. But, Africa is much bigger, even so much more bigger than the US, so many different language groups and things, but there is a common destiny. The question is, how could we avoid falling into the trap of authoritarian abuses of individual freedom, or just having that type of central influence not become abusive, as we've seen so many times under fascism? So how could we balance that great centralized power that you're calling for, which I'm not against, but at the same time as ensuring that people don't lose their freedom, that they could still participate and other things in that process, because it's been very, very difficult to get people on the same page in Africa up until this moment. I don't know which one of you gentlemen want to tackle that difficult topic.
Yeah, let me bring out a couple of things for what you said and what Lawrence said as well. Yeah, Lawrence talked about energy as a very important source of this is to power Africa's growth. He also talked about even the abundance of gas that I know we have so much even in Nigeria, because if you've heard about the concept of gas flaring, all these multinational companies, they prefer to flare gas because it's cheaper for them than to recycle it. Yep. But what happens? The authorities turn a blind eye because they take care of them. All right. So that's an issue. I remember, I think in '95, I was at a place called Omoko. Ajib Oil was there. And that's when I really experienced what is called gas flaring. The entire community, they change their rooftops every 2 years. Right? The plants there are not, they can't engage in meaningful agriculture. And I spoke to the community relations officer then, and they provide money for some community relations things to offset some of these issues. But what happens to the money? the chiefs and some other people use this to send their kids abroad, and they live wonderful lifestyle. So that is one thing. Remember, another thing also is always about power, what I call policy somersault. Lawrence, you remember in 2013 when Obama came out with all this Power Africa initiative and all that. So to help to provide power in most African countries that are usually dark and stuff. Today, what's the outcome? Nobody is talking about that. So yes, the African Union is there, but the effectiveness is something else. So to what extent can all these countries coordinate their policies together? Unfortunately, gentlemen, I think that one of the problems Africa has is I'm sure some of you are familiar with the division of Africa, the Francophone, the Anglophones. Sometimes they don't really agree on certain issues common to, Africa. I discussed this with one ambassador of what's this country now in Africa? So in Central Africa. So economic development will be because even Europe has different languages and all that. Yet through economic development, they're able to tie themselves together. So that's why I think economic development will be the thing that will bring Africa together. Like when we are discussing issues about like all these rail lines and so on and so forth, because even the food security issue, the food challenge, Zimbabwe used to be the basket nation of the Southern African countries, right? Nigeria was exporting. Do you know Malaysia that today is exporting even palm oil? Took palm oil kernels from Nigeria to develop, and they have gone so far. So the government should also prioritize agricultural development as a springboard towards economic development and food security. Because when people are hungry, a hungry man, they say, knows no law. And if you don't know any law, everything will be chaos. So there is abject hunger in the land. It's not. I've been to several African countries, the same thing across the board. So people are suffering, So because they can't feed well, okay? So there should be more emphasis on food production. All the entire youth population, if we focus their attention to agricultural development, make it mechanize it and make it functional, that will change the paradigm. And how can we mechanize agriculture when we don't have effective power supply? Even this railway system we're talking about will require power supply, right? So the investments in infrastructure, especially electricity, should be key. It will be a catalyst to all that kind of developments across the board, So, moreover, like you mentioned, United States and all that, yeah, Africa is greater, is more than United States in terms of population and everything, right? However, the commitment to the public good is different. So there are a lot of leaders in the United States that engaged into, having a legacy they can leave when they go out of power. But sometimes, most times in Nigeria or in African countries, when you assume power, most of them think they're going to stay there permanently. And some of them just see it as a ticket to outlandish lifestyle. Yeah, as a matter of fact, in most African countries, the moment you're given a position, people are thinking about, now that things have changed, what are you going to give me? I've argued even with some young people in Nigeria, I remember, when they say, this guy is not a commissioner, he's not a governor, he's not giving us money. I said, what do you want him, how much is he paid? And he said, no, stop thinking like that. They say, they think that maybe I'm having an American mentality or something. I say, no, where do you want him to get that money to give you? He brings that money to give you, complain that he has not done well in his office. So it's a cycle. So that commitment to public good should be the thing. And regrettably, in most African countries, those people who are interested in really bringing about the public good will not have the chance to come and govern. You discover that those people who are able to play according to the rules of the elites or the people, kingmakers, are the people who ultimately come to power. Although it happens in many countries anyway. But at least when you get into have a modicum of interest for the public, not just about yourself. All right. And part of it is also when we don't have effective rule of law. Like you commit fraud, you get away with it because you are highly connected. It's true, things are changing in the United States, but there's still some semblance of rule of law. People are still afraid of, defrauding the system because the consequences, right? And the consequences will meet you whether you're rich or poor or whatever you are. Unlike, in fact, I'm sure, like when Donald Trump was indicted and convicted, I'm sure such a thing can never happen in Nigeria. So that will tell you, so when someone goes into office and siphons money like that and is free walking around, it doesn't really give hope. Right. I met Paul Biya in Washington. This man was almost like crawling. This guy has been in power since 1982. What are you doing there? What are you offering? Mugabe will come to the United Nations and he's sleeping at the General Assembly. He doesn't even follow what is going on. And you say you're a leader of a country. So that's why people like me are even suggesting that there has to be a way we can wipe out all the gerontocracy in most African countries and, institute young people to govern, because they have a stake in the future of the country. So these old people, they stay there and as captives, people are just using them to, bring down the government, or the country, so to speak. Most of them don't know what's happening in their government. They're sleeping.
Yeah.
I'm still yeah.
Well, I mean, you touched on, of course, one of the key issues is poverty and hunger. And frankly, I think the focus, or pseudo-focus really, by some organizations, the West, NGOs, etc., that on instilling or imposing democracy on African nations is really either cynical or evil, because you're not going to have democracy when people are living in poverty and hunger. It's not going to happen, because poverty and hunger makes them very desperate. And desperation does not breed democracy. Democracy in its truest form, if we go back to Plato and Socrates, is the citizen discussing policy for the future of their nation.
Right.
Which means that people have to have a material standard of living. They have to have a house or an apartment that has electricity 24/7, that has separate rooms for their children to study, that has libraries or internet access now. The key is an educated citizen. And you can't have an educated citizen without a physical material foundation for your standard of living. So that's why for me, democracy requires electricity. It requires food. It requires leisure time. It requires infrastructure to have real democracy. And the point that, about food that Matt pointed to, a couple of years ago, I saw a figure for $40 billion of imported food into Africa. $40 billion. And that has to be paid in foreign exchange, because no African currency is accepted on the international market. That's criminal. When I first got to Africa in the 1990s, I saw the potential for agriculture immediately in Nigeria, all over Nigeria and Sudan. I was all over these countries. The countries in Africa, when they were liberated from the British colonial and French colonial and Portuguese colonial powers, were closer to self-sufficiency than they are today. They were near self-sufficiency. The actual West destroyed food production. The IMF program, the structural adjustment programs, was the biggest rotten failure that African nations were forced to accept. And I saw this up front in Nigeria. It was a fraud, and it destroyed their ability for infrastructure, for industry, for everything. So the fact of the matter is, African nations have not really participated in real development like other nations in the East and in the West. There was recently an article by a fellow I followed, Guido Moore, former minister in Liberia. And he wrote, and I concurred, that the long waves of colonialism and of the Berlin Conference, and then the liberal economic policies of the Bretton Woods system towards Africa, these have had long wave, detrimental, horrible effects. That doesn't mean they can't be overcome. But Africa has never been treated by the West as sovereign nations that we should help develop, not because of some simple liberal tendency to do good, but it's in the United States development. It's in the United States' interest to have a developed Africa. We spend hundreds of billions of dollars, maybe trillions, on kinetic warfare defense, so-called helping Africa. And it hasn't helped them at all. It hasn't stopped violent extremism, because people are living in poverty. And you look at the coup countries that you mentioned, Niger, which is rich with certain uranium and other minerals, they threw out the French. And they threw out the United States, which had $100 million counterintelligence drone base. So what good did these things actually accomplish? Nothing.
Yeah. Well, see, that's the power of honesty. It's so rare in polite society to just hear an honest discussion about some of these problems, because we're often told things like, well, look how much money Africa's been given, trillions of dollars over decades, and look at the poverty. And so, of course, there needs to be some foreign body going in there in some way managing things, because they can't do it themselves. And a lot of Africans that I've encountered even start believing some of this garbage. And it's dangerous, because then if you just look at the reality, it's completely dishonest that no, this didn't happen by the fault of anybody by and large. This is not the fault of Africa. This is because you have a dishonest program to break the kneecaps of somebody being told, hey, you have to win the race, but then you're breaking their kneecaps. There's covert intelligence agencies overthrowing governments that are actually trying to do the thing again and again and again. And then you have IMF structural adjustment. And then you have Kissinger policies like the SSM 200 policy going, outlining a need for, ensuring Africa doesn't access high technology development. So it really boggles my mind. But then the question still becomes, okay. Oh, and I'll say one more thing, that just because I'm feeling a bit emotional about this, they abuse the word democracy, because they're like, oh, once you have democracy, then you can have development. It's like, wait a minute, it has never worked for that ever. In any country that has any development, it didn't. Nope. It's not like everybody just democratically voted to, build a rail grid or an electricity grid. That never happened. But to have democracy requires that baseline of people can't be living in hunger, in fear of the future, in fear of other things. Like you have to have energy, transport, and you made that point, Larry, that the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, which is a great idea, like getting rid of trade barriers, having some sort of a common identity that begins to get built up in a more serious way, or there's even a payment system in Africa that's come online since 2021. It's good, but it's still lacking. You made the point, without a serious plan to execute energy, transport, water programs, agricultural mega projects, it's going to fail. So to do that requires money. Where does this money come from? Because right now I don't see a lot of ideas creatively about. It seems like it shouldn't be a reason to not end hunger, is because, oh, we don't have money. But yet that's what we're all hearing. So what is your solution, Larry, for that type of problem? And then I'll throw it at Dr. Ekwo.
Well, sure. They don't need money; they need credit. And
what's the difference? What you differentiate that? What does that mean as two different ideas?
They need credit is lending instrument that takes you from the present to the future. It's not how much money you have on your bank account that day. So they need long-term, low-interest loans. Now, there's a lot of attacks on Africa and China, including this lying, idiotic phrase that Africa is indebting China is indebting African countries deliberately to seize their assets. There's no assets that have ever been seized by China of Africa. But they do issue loans, which the United States doesn't. And this is this is something that defies the heritage of the United States, because if you read, there's a book that came out a few years ago on the Bretton Woods, and they have detailed documents and letters and communiques back and forth between Roosevelt and the two people representing him at the Bretton Woods Conference. The idea was what we call the World Bank, which was full name is, I think, the International Bank for Reconstruction. This was intended to lend capital. It's explicit in these communiques, intended to lend capital to African nations to help them industrialize. So that's 1944. So we're 80 years past. The agricultural problem, now the good news is that some countries have begun on their own to reverse the deficit in food production. There actually were some minor attempts by President Buhari of Africa. He was a president for 2 terms who recently passed away. Then Ethiopians are very aggressively trying to eliminate their food deficit. They can have another surplus year in wheat production. They've targeted other areas. So individual nations are making efforts. Zimbabwe is a crime because they are the potential breadbasket of South Africa, but they've been heavily sanctioned for 30 years or 20 years since 1999, when Mugabe gave the land back to Black Zimbabwe. The president of Zimbabwe today is personally sanctioned. So the West is not doing anything, doesn't care. To be honest, doesn't give a damn about the development of Africans. And therefore, they're not helping at all. So therefore, we have to set up different mechanisms for credit development. I proposed an international reconstruction development bank, which would, once capitalized, would lend out money strictly for infrastructure.
Would that be for all countries, or for just Africa, or for all countries of the world?
Well, I propose this for Africa, an international reconstruction development bank of Africa.
Okay.
And to focus solely on infrastructure, and there will be no loans for anything else. The bank, once capitalized, would lend a portion of its money, and then the country involved would have to match that amount for infrastructure. And these are the kinds of institutions which we may get other nations in the world to help capitalize. There are various forms of money and pensions and other programs in Africa that can be part of it. But we have to have a dedicated credit line for infrastructure. These projects are big, they're expensive, but they actually are transformative. And if we invested in them, such as many other projects I work on, we would have changed Africa already. Yeah. So the idea that they're too big or too expensive is a fallacious argument. These are what is necessary. And as I say, there are small areas of improvement that individual African nations are making, and that those should be applauded and supported in energy and infrastructure. But we need a more cohesive effort that should actually be supported by the West and by the East, and I believe it would be supported. Let me just say one thing before I hand the mic over, just to my friend Uchenna, because we know Nigeria so well together. One of the positive things that I did see in Nigeria on this limited 9-day visit I had was there was a change in some of the areas of government. I don't know the top levels, but I met with civil servants, mainly in the transportation sector, but I met with civil servants who are dedicated professionals, who not thinking about money and power, they're actually thinking about the positive steps forward that Nigeria has to make, which was they're younger and they're completely well organized and they are trying to do their job. I met some of the same type of people in the military. So this could be part of a new generation of people in their 40s and 50s who are going to lead and energize African nations to overcome some of the problems we've been discussing.
Yeah. So, good point. And on that note that you talked about youth population, I I must emphasize, like we're now looking for solutions. We've actually looked at some of the obstacles and stuff, because the young population actually, actually, let me look at this from 4 prisons, because Matt talked about democracy and illusion of democracy, all right? So, and yes, I also bring the concept of, that's what we call cultural norms theory in the media, that seem to give people the impression of whatever they see in the media. Like Matt talked about people now believing that yes, Africans they have to depend on the West and all that. It's because of what information that have been fed over time, repeatedly. It gets into their subconscious. People like me who straddle on both sides. I know Africa, I know the West, so I'm able to, dissect some of the dissimilarities and similarities. Even when I travel to some African countries, I explain to them that, the Ethiopian perception about how the West is not really what it is, The same thing, I come to the United States and explain to some people here that Africa is not the way you think it is. Like Lawrence is now telling you some of the changes that are occurring. So let's look at this from the prism of the role of the diaspora, people like myself, all right? Diaspora, development, demography, and democracy. Those 4 Ds, can catalyze our conversation essentially. So Lawrence talked about having a unique credit system and setting up an African development bank, an African reconstruction bank. But we already have the ADB, the African Development Bank, that is supposed to be playing that role. And to the extent to which they have succeeded, although they're not, I'm not sure they're into thinking about credit system, but which is something they should really consider. And I'm not sure within the global policy agenda, there won't be any appetite to set such a bank, knowing that IMF is there, which if they set such a bank, the African nations will no longer be coming to IMF to borrow money and stuff like that. So at the end of the day, why the world may not necessarily buy into what Lawrence said about having a reconstruction bank, which is a good thing, but I know the appetite is not there because of obvious reasons. So it boils down to self-reliance. If African leaders can rally around the African Development Bank and implement some of the ideas like Lawrence is talking about, that'll be fine. There's huge resources in Africa. No matter how little, let them start somewhere. The idea of thinking that someone will come and solve your problem from outside is not possible. With everything anybody says about Donald Trump, one thing I think, because sometimes I don't just look at things from the negative all the time, right? There's a positive side of Trump's dismantling of all these aid to African countries and all that, because you now begin to think. You see, Professor Ali Mazuri, there's something he said in his African heritage. He talks about necessity being a mother of invention. And he goes ahead to say that abundance is the mother of inertia. Because, like in Nigeria, can you believe that there was a time a leader in Nigeria even said he didn't know what to do with the money we have in Nigeria? Think about that. There was so much surplus money that he didn't know what to do with it. When I think about that, it baffles me. So there is money in Africa. In Nigeria, 10% of the population, if they should just release their money, the money they got from the system that should not belong to them, they release it, Nigeria will be a different place. I know the country so well. I've interacted with some of those people too. So I know what I'm talking about. There's so much money, but some of them still have that old paradigm, this and that, you have to put money, on the ground somewhere, instead of recycling it. Even in the United States, I tell them there's corruption in the United States, but the difference is that people engage in corruption and invest it in the United States, not to take it outside. And it recycles. You can take money from the system in the United States and invest it here, create jobs. But in Nigeria or Africa, they will steal the money and come and buy houses here in cash, $90 million, and be paying tax to a different country instead of doing that in your country. So that's where I shift. So let me come to the issue of diaspora impact, because young populations that, the digital diaspora links, Pan-African civil society networks and the new African business champions, they amplify cultural and economic Pan-African, orientation impulses all over the place, in a better way than the so-called elite can do. So, because quite frankly, I was discussing with the officials of Enugu state government in Nigeria, I realized how they recruited some people from UK. Actually, I spoke to one of them because I got curious, because in Enugu, it's an Igbo nation. That's where I come from. So when the person they referred me to, I had her name sounded like Yoruba from the Southwest. I was kind of curious to know how come, they hired it. They said the governor is thinking differently. He doesn't care where you come from. He gives you positions on basis of competence. And this lady told me she came back from UK to help in the transformation of the state. That's huge. I kind of like that. So there are a lot of people in the diaspora who can join, in the continent to improve the continent. The remittance from the diaspora is huge. As a matter of fact, Nelson Mesone, he used to be the ambassador of what's this country? The Bongo country. I remember the name of the country in Central Africa. There's something he suggested. I've mentioned this a lot of times, but it's a brilliant idea. How about all these money transfer agencies, Western Union, this one, they're doing business in Africa, making a lot of money. The AU or the leadership in Africa can liaise either on a country-to-country basis or as a continent. Okay, you guys are doing business in the continent. If I pay $8 to $700 to Nigeria, out of that $8 commission, can you just give Africa 50 cents? And we'll keep this thing in an account, and it grows big. It can deal one problem or the other, but will the will be there? I thought it was a very brilliant idea, and these companies will not lose any. They will like it because that will be a contribution to a place they are doing business. If you play hardball with them, they will comply. And this money, think about 50 cents out of maybe $22 billion that Nigerians send every year to Nigeria. Take 50 cents out of that. It's something. You can pay school fees. You can build a structure here and there. I'm just giving as an example. These are solutions. Yeah. So you don't have to wait for the West to come and help you negotiate with people who are doing business in your country. All right. So if Halliburton is doing business in Nigeria, don't encourage them to bribe some people and all that. Make them to pay the dues. Do the right thing. And if they know you do the right, if they know that you believe in doing the right thing, they won't engage in corrupting the officials, and the money will be legitimately made and transferred to the government. So the demography aspect of it is that the young people are angry. They want to see change. Most young people who are also in the diaspora want to contribute. They have, honed their skills. There are a lot of talent they have acquired here. They can replicate that, in the whole country. And let me also say something. Lawrence, I think in 2024, I think you were there in New York when we hosted this something about the 50th anniversary. Sorry, that was 2013, sorry. The 50th anniversary of AU. So there's this lady who has been covering the United States for 52 years. There's something he said, I will never forget that, and I've drawn the attention of leaders in Africa on this night. The cost of doing business in Africa is terrible. Is really bad. So sometimes when they call their different embassies, you won't get a response. The communication is poor. And that's why when you want to do business, let's say in Nigeria, someone who is a fraudster will pretend that he is the governor of Central Bank. And you go and do business with the person, and your money will get lost, and you say the system is bad. Because the consul generals don't even do their job so well to explain to people, this is how you can get this thing done. This is the channel to do business. So in other words, foreign investment will not grow when people who are investors do not know the channel to follow. It's a big challenge. So that has to change. So these are little baby, steps that can make a lot of difference. Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, I don't want to cut you off, but yeah, it does go back to the question of awareness, education, expanding one's consciousness and identity to understand what is necessary. Because if we're living in a world of scarcity, and that's the logic that we are tuned to, then there's no way we could organize the various. I mean, there's so many diasporas of the world, so to get them on the same page to say, okay, this is a good idea, let's do this thing, which will still require certain mechanisms, like whatever, an offshoot of the IMF or whatever, to then manage the funds that then take a certain portion out that go towards the benefit of Africa. It still requires education and a cultural movement that can bring about that higher understanding, and also responsibility of leadership that will manage that type of very powerful system as well that you propose. So we always come back to the question of culture and the mind and the battle of the mind. But I'm wondering here, like, if we know that we definitely need, like, hunger needs to end, poverty needs to end, war needs to end. These are objectively true things that need to happen. We know that these are also being increased by dishonest actors. We won't name names or go into details, but we know that a lot of these things are not organically emerging natural sociological phenomenon, right? Like, that's the way we're taught. Oh, terrorism, it's just there's always a portion of the population that will want to be terrorists. It's like, no. I know what the CIA does. I know what MI6 has done. I know the nature of controlled poverty that creates the desperation that results in people getting recruited to these things. So those are falsehoods. But then, how do we actually get this in a practical way? And I'm seeing right now amongst leaders within, like, along the continent, there's more positive things that I'm seeing now than I can find in many decades of past research. As far as the Grand Renaissance Ethiopian Dam is a beautiful example of something that has not been done since Kwame Nkrumah or even earlier. There's rail lines that are being built up concretely right now in Ethiopia, Kenya, and beyond, Tanzania. The ideas that were coming out of this conference in Nigeria that you were just at, Larry, is beautiful. These are great ideas. And I'm just wondering, like, would it be the case that it would be probably because you were saying this would be this idea of credit versus money. It's a provocative idea. Like, credit is a different idea than simply money that you have to put on your balance sheets, and you think about it more mathematically. Credit is being something that creates the future, that's associated with action. It seems like that's not well understood anymore today, but it was understood better in the past when Lincoln was alive and FDR was alive. It's not so present in people's minds. Is there anybody in Africa currently who are thinking on those lines, who understand the principle of productive credit versus simply money? Is there a movement of awareness in the culture and in the leadership throughout Africa towards this?
Well, I'm not aware that people have this understanding, although in Ethiopia, where I've spent a lot of time recently, there has been, I initiated discussion of Alexander Hamilton and his credit policy. And this has been picked up by one of the young intellectuals from Oromia who wrote an article based on what he understood Hamilton's policies were. So there's a discussion that I've initiated on this level. I don't know how far that discussion has gone, but the larger question in terms of how we're going to change Africa, as I said, we've all seen some positive steps forward, but we really just have to change the paradigm. Without that, I don't think you're going to see the full potential, because as I said, what we heard President Ramaphosa of South Africa say, what we've heard President Xi of China and many others say, is we need a new financial architecture. In the 70s, This was called a new just world economic order. We need to have a different paradigm where the concern is development, which it does not exist in the West. I don't even think anybody in the Democratic Republican Party for the last 50 years has really understood development is raising the standard of living of people. It's not imposition of your ideology or your policy. It's giving people more physical wealth per capita, per square kilometer, so that they can improve their lives and existence and build a better future. The hope that I see is what's going on in the global South and the transformations of more and more voices from more and more organizations. We've identified the BRICS. We have the Shanghai Cooperative Organization, which just met recently as well. There is this movement, and it's the majority of the world, and it's the majority of the people, and it's the majority of the governments, and it's the majority of natural resources, that we have to reorganize the financial system. The IMF and World Bank won't do it, not since they rejected Roosevelt's plans at Bretton Woods. The current IMF, World Bank, they lend no money, and they lend it at high interest rates. And if we want to turn the African Development Bank into an infrastructure bank, then they have to have a bigger capitalization, and they have to give larger long-term loans. They give in the hundreds of millions for a few years for a water project or a sanitation project, which is fine. But we need billions of dollars because, as you said, credit takes us from the present to the future. It's a vehicle for potential. It gets you a potential that you can't have in the here and now, but you can have in the future as long as you understand what your future is. And you take the question of poverty. Okay, right, out of a majority of almost 700 million in poverty, Africa has almost 500 million in poverty, and Nigeria has 130 million of those in poverty. Poverty below $2.15 a day. Is that an insurmountable problem? No. China did it. They went from bicycles to EVs. They transformed from 36 years average longevity to 78 years of longevity of life.
Right.
Doubled it, more than doubled it. We know how to eliminate poverty. Manufacturing, agriculture, infrastructure. It can be done. It's not discovering something new, but the West is against it. And we have to understand that. So we need the rallying of good thinking, well-meaning Africans and others and Asians and people from all over the world who support the demand for a new global paradigm, which can bring about this development. There is no single objective reason except culture, ideology, and willful evil policies against it that we can't have a fully. My goal is we could eliminate hunger and poverty in 20 years. Absolutely before 40. Well,
that was Franklin Roosevelt's Four Freedoms vision in 1941. That the world should have the freedom of that the American Revolution was not something localized in his mind to 13 colonies, 13 states, but was rather an expression of a universal aspiration of the species to have these freedoms, but then also additionally the freedom from want, the freedom from fear, the freedom from war, and beyond for everybody. So that idea as a principle is something which I think we've been yearning for and fighting for, and certain agencies, for whatever reason, have thought it not in their interest to allow humankind to just simply evolve to the next phase of our natural maturity, which is a sick, unfortunate thing. And hopefully we're reaching a point where we could finally learn how to be human properly, because we've screwed up way too many times over the past centuries and millennia. Dr. Uchenna, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to throw out there before we wrap up today's show?
Yeah, basically, let me just say that it's important for us to really tap into the opportunities presented by the multipolar world in which we live today. Because, like I said at the beginning, the era of darkness, that characterized those 60s, 70s, and even 80s, have been smashed by the intrusion of technology, especially communication technology. That we're able to monitor what's going on elsewhere, learn what is happening, and also to manage our expectations. Because sometimes when I go to some African countries and they always make reference to the United States and all that, I'm quick to remind them that this is a country of 250 years. They passed through some of these things you're going through right now. But the important thing is that communication has made it possible for people to think that you can just leapfrog from a certain level to the next one. It doesn't happen. So, the substantive multipolar bargaining power, is achievable, but not inevitable, and somehow, we cannot allow this opportunity of this generation, of this moment, enabled by technology, the AI potentials and all that. We should not squander that opportunity. The next decade must be very decisive, quite frankly. With the right choices, Africa can translate political unity into real manufacturing jobs, stronger value chains, and more geopolitical agency. With AU, there is ECOWAS, there is SADC, there are all these regional bodies. All of them can really integrate to make sure that we have stronger value chains and more geographical entity that can represent, especially the burgeoning youth population. Because that's why I emphasize demography, democracy, development, and the power of the diaspora. So those pillars will definitely transform Africa in the coming years. Thank you.
That was beautifully said. Dr. Ekwo, thank you so much for joining me. Lawrence, thank you so much once again for joining me. And the links to your books, Dr. Ekwo, will be in the description box under this video. Lawrence, your website will also be under this video. I encourage people to also subscribe to Lawrence's Substack. Very, very useful piece of information to get in your inbox every few days or so. So guys, thank you so much. And I look forward to future conversations. Take care.
Thank you.
Are we off the